first scream was so small that almost nobody heard it. It disappeared beneath the sound of crystal glasses touching beneath the elegant melody flowing from the grand piano beneath the laughter of men who had spent the evening discussing fortunes larger than most people could imagine. Inside Chicago's most luxurious restaurant, the world felt untouchable. Outside, someone's entire world was falling apart. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Tell us your city and country in the comments below, because it is always incredible to see people joining from every corner of the world. And if stories about courage, honor, and timeless legends inspire you, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes character matters more than fame. Now let's step back into a cold autumn evening that nobody who witnessed it would ever forget. The wind rolled through downtown Chicago, carrying yellow leaves across the sidewalks like tiny waves. Streetlights reflected against rain-soaked pavement. Luxury cars lined the entrance of the Grand Wellington restaurant, one of the most prestigious places in the entire city. Valets hurried between expensive automobiles. Waiters welcomed politicians. Hollywood actors smiled for photographers. Judges, senators decorated military officers. Famous athletes, television personalities, and business leaders gathered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Everything about the evening spoke of elegance. Everything, except the man sitting quietly in the far corner, John Wayne. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo with a crisp white shirt and a simple black bow tie. No bodyguards, no entourage, no photographers following him. Just an older man enjoying a quiet dinner after spending the afternoon speaking at a veterans charity fundraiser. Many guests recognized him immediately. Older veterans nodded respectfully as they walked past. Several waiters smiled with admiration. A retired Marine quietly whispered to his wife, "That's Duke." His wife smiled. "I know." Neither of them interrupted his meal. Respect sometimes meant allowing a man his peace. John Wayne appreciated that. He had spent decades standing beneath movie lights. Tonight, he simply wanted silence. A waiter carefully poured coffee into his cup. John thanked him with a quiet smile. "You've been working hard tonight." The young waiter looked surprised. Few wealthy guests noticed people serving them. John always did. "My father taught me," John once said, "that a man's character shows most clearly in how he treats people who expect nothing from him." The waiter smiled proudly. "Thank you, sir." John nodded. "No, thank you." Then he returned to reading the evening newspaper beside his plate. Across the restaurant, businessmen discussed billion-dollar investments. A famous singer laughed loudly beside a television producer. A governor shook hands with reporters. Everyone seemed important. Everyone seemed busy. Nobody noticed the little family walking outside. Not yet. Only a few blocks away. Mary Collins tightened her thin jacket against the cold wind. She was 32 years old, a widow mother to one little girl. She had just finished working a double shift at Miller's Family Diner. Her feet ached. Her hands were rough from washing dishes. Her paycheck barely covered rent, but beside her walked 6-year-old Emily. Emily held her mother's hand tightly while skipping over puddles. Her blonde curls bounced beneath a little red knitted hat. She wore a faded blue coat that had once belonged to her cousin. Her tiny backpack looked almost bigger than she was. Mama Mary smiled. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we still getting ice cream?" Mary laughed, despite her exhaustion. "I promised, didn't I?" Emily nodded excitedly. "You never break promises." Mary squeezed her daughter's hand. "No, I don't." She reached into her pocket. Only a few dollars remained after groceries. Enough for one small ice cream, maybe two if she skipped breakfast tomorrow. It didn't matter. Emily had earned it. Children remembered promises. Parents remembered sacrifices. Mary was willing to make one more. Always one more. They turned onto West Harrison Street. The sidewalk suddenly became quieter. Most shops had already closed. The bright lights of downtown faded behind them. Only the distant glow of the Grand Wellington restaurant remained ahead. Mary noticed the silence. She pulled Emily a little closer. "Stay beside me." Emily obeyed immediately. Then someone whistled. Mary ignored it. Another whistle, then laughter. 3 men stepped out from beside an alley. Their clothes were dirty leather jackets, heavy boots, faces hardened by years of alcohol and violence. The tallest one smiled. It wasn't kindness. It was hunger. "Evening, sweetheart." Mary kept walking. The second man moved into her path. Why so serious? Emily hid behind her mother. Mary spoke calmly. We don't want any trouble. The third man laughed. Neither do we. The leader looked directly at Emily. What a cute little girl. Mary instantly placed herself between them. Every instinct inside her awakened. Predators always revealed themselves eventually. You've said enough. She tried walking around them. The tallest thug grabbed her wrist. Hard. She jerked away. Let go. Instead, he smiled wider. You've got spirit. The second thug reached toward Emily. Mary slapped his hand away instantly. Don't touch my daughter. Several people walked along the opposite sidewalk. They looked. They slowed down. Then they kept walking. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted involvement. Nobody wanted responsibility. The leader sighed dramatically. You embarrassed my friend. Mary answered quietly. I'm asking one last time. Move. Instead, the thug punched her across the face. Emily screamed. Mary crashed onto the cold sidewalk. Her purse slid into the street. Groceries scattered everywhere. Apples rolled beneath parked cars. A loaf of bread landed in a puddle. The men laughed. Emily ran toward her mother. Mary pushed her backward. No. One thug kicked Mary in the ribs. Another grabbed her purse. The third ripped the necklace from around her neck. Emily cried harder than she ever had before. Mama. Mary looked into her daughter's terrified eyes. Every mother understands moments like this. Moments when fear becomes smaller than love. Using every ounce of strength she had left, Mary shoved Emily away. Run! Another kick landed. Mary gasped. Find someone. Emily froze. Mary screamed again. Go! The little girl turned and ran. Not because she wanted to leave, because her mother had told her to. Sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is obey. Emily ran through crowded sidewalks, unable to see through her tears. People brushed past her. Businessmen, tourists, couples, taxi drivers. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked why a little girl covered in tears and streaks of blood was running alone. One woman looked, then looked away. A man carrying expensive shopping bags stepped around her without slowing down. Someone muttered, Where are her parents? Nobody searched for the answer. Aye. Emily could barely breathe. Mama. She whispered it again and again, between sobs. Then she saw it. Warm golden lights, large glass windows, the grand Wellington restaurant. People inside looked safe. Surely someone there would help. She pushed open the heavy doors. The pianist stopped playing. Every conversation ended. Every eye turned toward the tiny girl standing in the entrance. Her red hat was soaked with tears. Her blue coat carried streaks of her mother's blood. She shook so violently she could barely stand. The restaurant manager stepped forward. Sweetheart. Before he finished, Emily began searching desperately across the room. Hundreds of elegant strangers, beautiful clothes, expensive jewelry, serious faces. Who could she trust? Then in the far corner she saw an older man sitting alone, calm, kind, safe. She didn't know his name. She didn't know millions admired him. She didn't know Hollywood called him a legend. She only knew his eyes didn't frighten her. Clear's throat. Emily ran toward him. She threw both tiny arms around his sleeve. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably. Through desperate sobs, she whispered the words that froze every heart in the restaurant. Mister, she struggled to breathe. They're beating my mommy. Tears streamed down her face. They're going to kill her. Please help us. John Wayne slowly looked down at the frightened little girl holding onto his arm. Then, without saying a single word, he quietly placed his fork on the table. For one long moment, nobody inside the Grand Wellington restaurant moved. Crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle overhead. The pianist's fingers hovered above the keys. Champagne glasses remained frozen halfway to waiting lips. Even the waiters stopped breathing. The only sound in the entire restaurant was the frightened sobbing of the little girl clinging to John Wayne's sleeve. Her tiny hands trembled so violently they could barely hold on. Tears mixed with the streaks of blood on her blue coat. John Wayne looked into her eyes. He had spent decades pretending to be heroes on movie screens. Tonight, there was no script, no director, no second take. Only a terrified child asking for help. He gently placed one weathered hand on her shoulder. His voice remained calm. What is your name, sweetheart? She struggled to answer. Emily. And your mother's name, Mary. Can you still show me where she is? Emily nodded immediately. I know where her voice broke again. They're hurting her. John slowly stood. His chair slid backward across the polished floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like thunder. He picked up his folded napkin, placed it neatly beside his plate, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, then looked at the restaurant manager. "If someone has already called the police," he said quietly, "tell them to hurry." The manager swallowed. No one has called yet." John looked directly at him, not angrily. "Simply disappointed." "Then please do it now." The manager rushed toward the telephone. Several wealthy guests suddenly stood. A senator whispered, "Those men could be armed." Another businessman shook his head. "Someone should stop him." A retired army colonel quietly replied, "No." Everyone looked toward him. The old colonel slowly stood. "If you've ever seen John Wayne when he makes up his mind," he smiled slightly, "you know there's no stopping him." John took Emily's tiny hand. "It'll be all right." She squeezed his hand as tightly as she could. "I was afraid nobody would help." John looked down at her. "Sometimes the first person who helps," he said softly, "is all it takes." Together they walked toward the restaurant doors. Almost half the restaurant silently followed, not because they wanted danger, because something inside them refused to remain seated anymore. Outside, the cold wind struck immediately. Police sirens were nowhere to be heard. Only distant traffic. Emily pointed with her shaking finger. "That way." John nodded. They began walking quickly through the narrow streets. As they rounded the corner, the sounds reached them first. A woman crying, men laughing, another dull impact, someone falling. Emily screamed, "Mommy!" John gently stopped her. "No." She looked up. "You stay behind me, but stay behind me." There was something about his voice, calm, steady, certain. Emily obeyed instantly. She held tightly to the back of his tuxedo jacket. They stepped around the final corner. Mary Collins lay against the sidewalk. Her lip was bleeding. One eye had already begun swelling shut. Her purse had been emptied onto the street. Family photographs, coins, groceries, everything scattered across the pavement. The three thugs surrounded her. The leader grabbed her coat. "You should have smiled." Another kicked her ribs. The third laughed. "Nobody cares." Mary tried to stand. She couldn't. She looked toward the street. No one came. The leader leaned closer. "See, I told you. People only help in movies." Then a deep voice interrupted the laughter. "No." The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. All three men turned. Standing beneath a glowing street lamp, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, was John Wayne. Beside him stood little Emily, hidden safely behind his shoulder. The wind gently moved the long black overcoat draped over his arm. His expression never changed. He looked first at Mary, then at Emily. Only then did he look at the men. The leader smirked. "Who are you?" John answered simply. "The first man tonight who decided to stop walking." Silence. Even the wind seemed to disappear. "One." The laughed loudly. "You serious?" Another looked at John's age and burst into laughter. "Grandpa wants to fight." The third spat onto the sidewalk. "You picked the wrong street." John ignored every insult. Instead, he slowly removed his tuxedo jacket, folded it carefully, without rushing, without fear. He handed it to Emily. "Would you hold this for me?" She nodded, still crying. He smiled gently. "Don't let go." "I won't." Then he rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. The crowd gathering behind him grew larger every second. Restaurant guests, taxi drivers, people from nearby stores. Windows opened overhead. Someone whispered, "That's John Wayne." Another answered, "It can't be." An elderly veteran looked closer. "Oh, it is." The leader cracked his neck. "So you really think you're going to save her?" John answered quietly, "No." The thug frowned. "I'm going to stop you." The three men exchanged amused glances. One charged first, wild, fast, angry. Exactly what John expected. The punch flew straight toward his face. John stepped sideways only inches. The fist cut through empty air. Before the attacker recovered, John grabbed his wrist, turned his momentum. The thug stumbled forward, straight into a metal newspaper box. The crash echoed through the street. The crowd gasped. The second thug rushed immediately. He swung a heavy right hook. John blocked with his forearm. The impact echoed sharply. Then, without wasting movement, John drove a short punch into the man's stomach. Not flashy, not theatrical, pure timing. The thug doubled over, unable to breathe. The third attacker saw both friends struggling. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket. Several women screamed. Emily buried her face in John's jacket. The crowd stepped backward. Someone yelled, "He has a knife!" John never moved. His eyes remained fixed on the blade, calm, calculating. The attacker smiled. "Now what, old man?" John answered softly. "Now you make your biggest mistake." The knife flashed forward. The street exploded into chaos. For a single heartbeat, the knife hung in the air. Streetlights reflected across its polished blade. Rainwater dripped from the attacker's sleeve. 8, maybe 10 feet away. Emily clutched John Wayne's neatly folded tuxedo jacket against her chest, so tightly that her tiny fingers had turned white. She couldn't breathe. Neither could anyone else. More than 50 people now stood around the scene. Restaurant guests, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, night shift workers. Not one of them spoke. They simply watched. The thug grinned viciously. "You should have stayed inside your fancy restaurant, old man." Without another warning, he lunged. The blade shot toward John's chest. A woman screamed. Emily shut her eyes, but John Wayne didn't panic. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He waited, exactly long enough. At the very last instant, he pivoted. The knife sliced harmlessly through empty air. Before the attacker even realized he had missed, John caught the man's wrist with both hands. Years earlier, during countless Western films, John had trained with military advisors, professional stunt coordinators, and former boxing instructors. I knew one truth better than most people. A reckless man defeats himself. John twisted the attacker's arm just enough to break his balance, not his bones. The knife clattered across the pavement. It slid beneath a parked taxi. The crowd gasped. The thug cried out in pain as he crashed shoulder first into the sidewalk. Before he could recover, John stepped back. He didn't strike again. He simply stood between the attackers and the mother, like a wall. Like an old oak tree refusing to move in a storm. The leader stared in disbelief. "What are you?" John answered quietly. "A man, nothing more, nothing less." The second thug finally caught his breath. His face burned with humiliation. 3 grown men embarrassed by someone old enough to be their father. Rage replaced reason. All 3 attacked together. The crowd shouted warnings. "They're coming!" John heard them. He was already moving, not quickly, efficiently. Every movement had purpose. The first man threw another punch. John blocked it and shoved him sideways. The second tried grabbing his shoulders. John turned, allowing the man to stumble directly into his own friend. They collided violently. The leader rushed from behind. John spun just enough to avoid another wild swing. The attacker's fist smashed into a brick wall instead. He screamed in pain. His knuckles split open instantly. John never celebrated. He never smiled. He simply kept protecting the only people who lying on the pavement. Emily still hiding behind him. One frightened witness whispered, "He's not trying to hurt them." Another answered, "He's only stopping them." The difference mattered. The leader finally understood. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't some frightened old celebrity. Every time they attacked, John answered only enough to stop the attack. Nothing more, nothing cruel, nothing unnecessary. The leader reached into his boot. This time, he pulled out a metal chain. Several people stepped backward. One businessman shouted, "Leave him alone!" Another finally grabbed his phone. "Where are the police?" "They're coming." The thug wrapped the chain around his fist. "You've made me look stupid." John looked directly into his eyes. "No, you did that yourself." The words landed harder than any punch. Roaring with anger, the thug swung the chain through the air. It whistled inches from John's face. Again, again, again. John calmly stepped around every attack, not wasting movement, not wasting energy. The thug grew slower, more desperate, more reckless. Finally, the chain became tangled around a nearby parking meter. For one tiny second, the leader couldn't pull it free. John moved. One firm strike against the man's forearm. The chain slipped loose. Another controlled shot. The leader stumbled backward, landing flat on the wet pavement beside his 2 companions. Silence. Absolute silence. 3 men, completely defeated. Not unconscious, not broken, simply unable to continue. John looked at them. His breathing remained steady. He could have continued. Nobody would have stopped him. Instead, he turned his back on them. He walked straight to Mary Collins. He knelt beside her carefully. "Ma'am," she opened one swollen eye. "Your daughter is safe." The first tear rolled down Mary's cheek. Emily John smiled gently. "You can look now." Emily ran. "Mommy." She threw herself into her mother's arms. Both of them cried uncontrollably. The crowd looked away, giving them a moment that belonged only to them. John quietly removed his clean white handkerchief. He handed it to Mary. She looked at it, then at him. I don't know how to thank you." John shook his head. "You already have." She looked confused. "You raised a brave little girl." Emily looked up. "I was scared." John smiled. "Bravery isn't being unafraid. It's doing the right thing while you're afraid." The little girl nodded slowly. She would remember those words for the rest of her life. Then the sound finally arrived. Police sirens. Closer, closer. Red and blue lights reflected across every window on the street. Several patrol cars stopped beside the crowd. Officers rushed forward with weapons drawn. "Nobody move!" Witnesses immediately pointed toward the three men lying on the pavement. "Those are the attackers. We saw everything. They beat that woman." Restaurant security guards arrived carrying surveillance recordings. A taxi driver stepped forward. "I recorded part of it." Another witness raised his phone. "So did I." Within minutes, the truth became undeniable. The officers handcuffed the three men. The leader glared at John Wayne. "You think you won?" John looked at him quietly, then answered with words nobody present would ever forget. "No. If I had won, that little girl would have never needed to ask a stranger for help." The street fell silent once again. Even the officers lowered their eyes because everyone understood exactly what he meant. The greatest tragedy wasn't the fight. It was that so many people had walked past before one man finally stopped. As paramedics gently lifted Mary onto a stretcher, she reached for John's hand. "Please don't leave." John squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'm not going anywhere." And, for the first time that entire night, Emily smiled. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded into the background. Police officers finished securing the crime scene. The three attackers sat handcuffed on the curb. Their heads hung low. The arrogance that had filled their faces only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. No one pitied them, not after what everyone had witnessed. The ambulance doors remained open while paramedics carefully examined Mary Collins. She winced every time they touched her bruised ribs, but her eyes never left her daughter. Emily refused to let go of her mother's hand. Every few seconds, she looked toward John Wayne, almost afraid he might disappear if she blinked. A senior police captain walked toward him, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, a man who had spent more than 30 years wearing a badge. He extended his hand. "Mr. Wayne." John shook it firmly. "I've heard stories about your courage." The captain smiled. "Tonight, I finally saw one with my own eyes." John gave a humble nod. "I simply arrived before you did." The captain looked toward the little girl. "No, you arrived before everyone else found the courage." Those words spread quietly through the crowd. Several people lowered their heads. The businessman who had walked past Mary earlier could no longer meet anyone's eyes. The young couple who had crossed the street pretending not to notice silently slipped away. Even some of the restaurant guests looked ashamed, not because they had committed the crime, because they had almost become witnesses instead of helpers. One elderly veteran slowly removed his hat. Looking at John, he said quietly, "I fought overseas for my country, but tonight you reminded me what courage looks like at home." John smiled respectfully. The hardest battles usually happen where nobody expects them. Nearby, Emily carefully walked toward John, still holding her mother's hand, still carrying his neatly folded black tuxedo jacket. She looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Mr. Wayne." "Yes, sweetheart." She held out the jacket. "I kept my promise." John accepted it with a warm smile. "You certainly did." She hesitated, then asked the question every adult standing nearby would remember forever. "Were you scared?" The entire street became silent. Everyone wanted to hear his answer. John slowly knelt until they were eye to eye. "Very." Emily blinked. "But I thought heroes aren't afraid." John gently shook his head. "No, heroes are afraid. They simply refuse to let fear decide what they do." Emily thought about those words, then nodded slowly. "I want to be brave like you someday." John smiled. "You already were." She looked confused. "When your mommy told you to run, you didn't freeze. You didn't hide. You searched until you found help." He gently tapped the tip of her nose. "That took more courage than you realize." Emily smiled through fresh tears. For the first time that terrible night, she believed him. The paramedics finished treating Mary. She slowly walked toward John despite her injuries. Her face was bruised. Her lip was swollen, yet gratitude shined brighter than the pain. She tried speaking several times before the words finally came. "I don't have money. I can't repay you," John answered immediately. "I wasn't looking for payment." She wiped away another tear. "Then at least let me thank you." "You already have." She looked puzzled. "My daughter is alive." John nodded. "That's thanks enough." Just then, one of the paramedics quietly approached. "Ma'am, we'll need to take you to the hospital for observation." Mary looked down. I can't afford," John gently interrupted. "Don't worry about that." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" John reached into his inside pocket without making a show of it, without allowing photographers to notice. He quietly handed an envelope to the hospital administrator, who had just arrived. Inside was more than enough money to cover every medical bill, enough to replace Mary's stolen belongings, enough to pay several months of rent, enough so Emily would never have to wonder whether her mother could afford groceries while recovering. The administrator stared in disbelief. Mr. Wayne John raised one finger. "Please, no announcements, no newspapers, no interviews. If anyone asks, tell them good people still exist." The administrator nodded silently. "I understand." Meanwhile, one of the handcuffed attackers suddenly spoke. His voice trembled. "Mr. Wayne." Everyone turned. The leader slowly stood with the officer's permission. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only shame. "I've been fighting people my whole life. I thought strength meant making everyone afraid." He swallowed hard, but he looked toward Emily. "That little girl had more courage than I ever did." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Nobody spoke. He turned toward Mary. "I'm sorry." Then toward Emily. "I'm sorry." Finally, he looked directly into John's eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness." John remained silent for several seconds. Then he walked close enough that only the nearby crowd could hear him. "You're right." The man lowered his head. "You don't deserve it." Another pause. "But neither did I." The attacker looked up in confusion. John continued. "Every man is given chances he hasn't earned. The question isn't whether you deserve another one. The question is, what will you become if life gives it to you?" The attacker began crying openly, not because of prison, not because of humiliation, because for the first time in years someone had spoken to the man he could become instead of only the man he had been. Television reporters finally arrived. Camera crews hurried across the sidewalk. Microphones stretched toward John. "Mr. Wayne, did you really stop 3 armed attackers?" "Again, we have a statement. How did you do it?" John adjusted his jacket, looked once more toward Mary and Emily, then answered with only a single sentence. "I wasn't the story tonight." The reporters looked confused. He pointed gently toward the little girl. "She was." Without another word, he turned and began walking away. No celebration, no dramatic farewell, no attempt to become tomorrow's headline, only quiet footsteps disappearing beneath the yellow glow of the Chicago streetlights. Emily suddenly broke free from her mother's hand. "Wait!" John stopped. She ran after him, wrapped her tiny arms around his waist. "I thought heroes only lived in movies." John smiled warmly. "The real heroes," he gently brushed a tear from her cheek, "are ordinary people who choose not to look away." Emily hugged him one last time. "I'll remember. I know you will." He tipped his hat, turned, and disappeared into the cold autumn night. The crowd remained silent long after he was gone. Not because they had watched an old Hollywood legend defeat 3 violent men, but because they had witnessed something far greater. A man who proved that courage is not measured by fists or fame or strength. It is measured by the direction you walk when everyone else is walking away. Years later, Emily would tell her own children about that unforgettable night. She wouldn't begin by talking about the fight. She would begin with the moment an elderly stranger quietly stood up from his dinner, took the hand of a frightened little girl, and reminded an entire city that true heroes don't wait for applause. They simply answer when someone cries for help.